Hello everyone, I'm Matt. I am a professional tutor with Sacred Heart Center for Teaching and Learning, and today I'm going to be giving a presentation on plagiarism, what it is, and how to avoid it. Now, before we get into any official definitions of plagiarism, I just kind of want to go around the room and ask, what's your definition of plagiarism?
So, according to me, what I've heard from everyone is plagiarism is representing someone else's work as not your own, or as your own, and not giving credit to them.
Exactly, very good. So not only is it presenting someone else's work as your own, but most importantly, you're not citing it. That is considered plagiarism. Matt?
Could it also be cheating on a test?
Yes, cheating on a test could also be considered plagiarism.
So what if I cite a source, but I don't cite it correctly? Is that plagiarism?
Good question. So if you're citing a source, but let's say the formatting's not all that great, that technically would not be considered plagiarism if the professor says to you, hey, this is cited improperly, can you please cite it properly? But if you keep doing it over and over and the professor keeps saying, hey, this is cited improperly, that now counts as plagiarism. So just to reiterate, plagiarism is the act of misrepresenting one's sources as one's own ideas. So this can include in essays. If you take someone's written words and you present it as your own, that's plagiarism. If you're doing an experiment, let's say you're working with your friend, if you present your friend's data as your own, that is considered plagiarism. Or if you take it from another already published source, that is also considered plagiarism. And finally, another example of plagiarism would be if you make up data. Another example could be if you're analyzing a speech and you claim that the words of the original author are words that you've said. That is considered plagiarism. And finally, another example would be in arts and music. If you create a work of art that you claim is your own, but it turns out it's someone else's, that is plagiarism. So it's important to recognize that there are two kinds of plagiarism. There is basically willful plagiarism, where you knowingly copy a source and claim it as your own, or negligent plagiarism, which is when either you don't know that you're copying from someone else, or again, if you're citing improperly multiple times and the professor said, hey, can you not do this? And it's important to remember that both of these forms of plagiarism are subject to penalty. So once again, some examples of plagiarism could be, again, copying whole passages from papers or books or any other published source and claiming it as your own, allowing another student to submit a copy of work that you've already submitted, and this includes paying someone else to write your paper, because again, you're not writing the paper, someone else is. Again, falsifying one's own scientific reports, or again, copying from another source. And also an example could be submitting an assignment that you've previously written for a class in a previous semester, but then submitting it again for a class in another semester. So that is considered plagiarism, and it's important to remember that assignments submitted during a particular semester can only be submitted during that semester. Yes?
Does it matter how much was copied?
Good question. So I'm going to say yes and no. Yes, obviously it does matter how much is copied, but again, even if it's like the tiniest amount, that is still subject to plagiarism. So if you're copying just, say, a few words or a sentence compared to like an entire paragraph, that is subject to equal penalty. Any other questions?
Yeah.
So how do I know when my thoughts are considered my own?
Good question. So if you're writing a paper and you're having trouble distinguishing, what are my own thoughts and what are the thoughts of someone else. So your own thoughts, I would say, are either your opinion on something. So let's say you're doing a book report and you say, I think The Great Gatsby wasn't that great. That's your own opinion. That technically counts as your own. And another example of your own work would be if you're doing an experiment and you yourself are observing the results of that experiment, that counts as your own. And again, just to remind you, if your friend's doing it and you cite it as your own, that is plagiarism. Lisa.
What's the main difference between directly quoting and paraphrasing?
Good question. So directly quoting would basically be, again, if you're doing a book report on something and you literally copy and paste a section from the book. That's directly quoting, because again, it's from the book. But paraphrasing, in a way, is kind of like summarizing. So let's say I read a passage of a book, and in my paper I write, the author says blah, 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 blah. Technically, while that's not coming from the book, that is still someone else's work, because I'm summarizing basically what someone else is saying. And it's important to realize that even though in the paper I may write, the author says this, that information still needs to be cited. Just saying the author says does not cut it. Any other questions?
On that question, so how do you counter that? Like, if you're supposed to report on some work and your source is someone else's work, so how do you make a paragraph out of what you have to answer?
What I would say is when you're taking notes on an assignment, it's important to note, the author says this, and then, if you're writing something, say, cite this. That's a good way to ensure that you're properly citing, or you're going to properly cite when you're writing the paper.
But can we cite an entire paragraph like that?
Yes. So we'll talk about this a little more, but basically in your paper, you don't have to be citing like every single sentence if it's from the same source. So if you're citing a paragraph and that paragraph only uses one other source, that citation for that source only needs to be at the end of the paragraph. All right, so now let's go over basically what would happen if you got caught plagiarizing. So if you get caught plagiarizing, the professor not only has the right to give you a 0 for the assignment, but they also have a right to give you an F for the course, which may not be forgiven. And after they give you an F for the course, the professor is obliged to report this violation to the office of the provost, and after that, the office of the provost then takes over the case from there. Matt.
Once a student's been reported, are they allowed to appeal that?
Yes, they are. They're allowed to appeal basically through the entire process. So let's say the professor accuses you of plagiarism initially. You have the right to say to the professor, no, I did not plagiarize. And again, provide the professor with proof. And let's say that your case goes all the way to the office of the provost. After you've been informed of the violation, you will be asked, basically, do you want to appeal this? And after that, you say yes, and then that begins a whole new process of you appealing to the office of the provost. Any other questions? Alrighty. So now that we've gone over some of the penalties for plagiarism, let's talk about strategies that you can do to avoid actually plagiarizing. So again, it's important to remember that credit must be given for another person's ideas, opinions, or theories, but not your own. Credit should also be given for, again, any facts, statistics, or any data that you are getting from another source that is not your own. Furthermore, it's important to cite any pieces of information that are not considered common knowledge. And once again, quotations and paraphrases of another person's spoken or written words need to be cited. Any questions? Yes.
What is considered common knowledge and open source?
Good question. So anything that is common knowledge or open source could basically be considered something like dates or, because I have a background in history, commonly agreed on historical facts. So for example, if I write in a paper, the Declaration of Independence was signed on July 4th, 1776, No one's going to dispute that. Now, if you claim that it was written on a different date, not only do you have to provide evidence for that claim, obviously, but you have to cite where you are getting that claim from. So to conclude this presentation, I'm going to give you guys a bunch of resources to help you avoid plagiarizing. So SHU has a number of great websites that you can go to in order to basically see, is what I'm doing plagiarizing? So for example, we have our academic integrity policy, which has a whole section on plagiarism. The library has resources on plagiarizing, and this includes asking librarians directly, not just going on this website. We also have our community standards page, specifically the section on academic dishonesty. Another great resource is your professor. Your professor is not there to ridicule you or to make you feel stupid. Your professor is there to help you, and they should know all of the policies and stuff about how to avoid plagiarizing. And finally, I want to talk to you guys about a new feature called the similarity checker, which is on Blackboard. But before I do that, are we all familiar with SafeAssign? Have we ever, when submitting a paper, have we ever encountered SafeAssign? You have? Yeah. Okay, great. So similarity checker is actually very similar to SafeAssign. This is basically the student version of SafeAssign. So in order to get there, if we go on the main page for Blackboard, we go over to the tab Organizations, and under there we click on the first link, which is Academic Resources for Students. After clicking on that, we go down to Academic Integrity and Plagiarism. And from there, there are not only instructions of how to use the student checker, but furthermore, there's the student checker itself. So after you've read the instructions and understand how to use the system, you can submit. And it's important to note that when you submit an assignment through this checker, this is not you submitting the final version of the assignment. You can use this basically before you submit the final version of whatever assignment you're submitting. All right, before I wrap up, any questions? Yes?
Just wanted to ask, how much time does it take to get an accurate score?
Good question. So it takes about 15 minutes. Yep. All right, I would like to thank everyone for coming to this presentation, and I hope you all found it useful. Thank you.